So for this last unit of this course, we're going to be kind of focusing on the links between intercultural communication, intercultural conflict, and social justice and social movements. And what I want to do in this lecture is I want to try to kind of develop a working definition, kind of like a working framework to understand social justice, because I think this is one of those terms that you've all heard many, many times before, but never really heard a real definition for. So that's kind of what I want to focus on for this lecture. And so social justice, when groups or people label themselves as social justice organizations, they're usually saying that they focus on one or more of the following characteristics. Full and equal participation of all groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Equal distribution of resources. That all members are physically and psychologically secure. Members mean members of a society or of a nation state. Individuals are self-determining, and that individuals are interdependent. And what I want to do for this lecture is I want to go through each one of these characteristics of social justice and give a little bit of more explanation as to what they mean. So the first characteristic of social justice is this idea of full and equal participation. So basically this idea that everyone has the right to full and equal participation in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. Mutually shaped to meet their needs. That means that the very structure of society is inclusive of everyone. So basically that society is not shaped to privilege any group over another. And really more specifically, it's about ending social stratification. We've talked about social stratification in this class before. Organizations or anyone that focuses on full and equal participation is trying to undo that. So some examples of this kind of focus on full and equal participation might be movements or anything against employment discrimination, equal access movements, so like equal access to healthcare, for example, and any sort of diversity and inclusion measures. These are all under the idea of wanting to have an institution or a society or some kind of structural thing that includes everyone. The degree to which that change looks like varies from between different people, but that's really kind of what unifies them all. The second characteristic is this idea of equal distribution of resources. And again, it's this idea that a nation state's resources should be distributed equally across all citizens. And so this photo on the left, for example, this is a chart from the Pew Research Center, and this is from 2013, I believe, that's looking at income inequality and how some of the richest, highest earning U.S. households and families hold a large portion, actually the majority of the nation's wealth. And so people who are interested in equal distribution of resources are interested in these kind of like wealth inequalities and what the impacts of those might be. So they're trying to challenge this idea that competition is necessary to have a strong, growing economy. You'll hear a lot of capitalists say this, that you need a little bit of inequality because it creates competition and it creates an incentive for people to work. That assumes that people are not going to do what's needed to meet their needs and to survive. So like to make sure that they have food and water, for example. And it's also this idea that competition is what helps an economy grow. But what a lot of people are finding is when you have so many people who can't afford to buy a home, who can't afford healthcare, who can't afford education, that actually what's maybe happening is that our growth as an economy is becoming stagnant. And so what a lot of people want is a more kind of equitable distribution of resources. And it also kind of challenges this idea of meritocracy, that if you just work hard, you will achieve what you want. What people who focus on equal distributions of resources argue is that when wealth inequality, for example, or wealth gap looks like what you see on the left, that creates very real barriers that people can't realistically catch up with to fill that gap. And some examples of kind of equal distribution of resources type movements might be like a progressive tax policy that aims to tax the wealthy. That would be an example of a social justice issue that focuses on equal distribution of resources. The third characteristic is this idea of physical and psychological security. And basically that all members of a nation state have the right to be physically and psychologically secure. And more specifically, it means that all members have the right to be free from physical violence, from psychological and emotional violence, and from structural violence. Violence from the state, basically. And so one kind of prime example of this is the end to transgender violence, the movements that are arising to end violence against transgender people. Transgender people experience large degrees of violence. The photo on the right is of a woman named China Doll Dupree from New Orleans, Louisiana, who was killed in February of 2017. 2017 has actually been a record high for homicide against transgender people. And just this year, 15 transgender people have been killed, and all of them were transgender women of color. And so what people who focus on either this particular issue or other similar ones is how particular groups of people, particularly poor people of color and poor transgender people of color, even more specifically, experience disproportionate levels of violence, whether it's physical, like homicide, psychological and emotional, so like harassment, or structural violence, which basically means anytime the state uses its power to cause harm, so things like police brutality, racial profiling, gentrification, anything that disproportionately affects particular groups of people and causes harm to them. And so people who kind of focus on this aspect of it are focusing on issues like this. The fourth one is the right to self-determination. And it's this idea that all members of a nation state should have the right to self-determination, which means being able to freely determine their political status and freely pursue economic, political, and cultural development. So basically, people get to make decisions for themselves and for their well-being on their own terms. So an example of this would be Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline movement and tribal sovereignty. This idea that Native American tribes should be able to make decisions about their people and their land on their own terms without interference from the U.S. government. Housing justice, that people shouldn't be barred from living in any particular neighborhood would be an example. And another example that's not listed here is reproductive rights, like this idea that women should have the right to choose whether to have a baby, to not have a baby, to have access to birth control, that they should be able to make those decisions about their bodies on their own without interference from the state. And so finally, the final characteristic of social justice is this idea of recognizing people as interdependent. And it's in part a recognition of the collectivism that we all need, but kind of don't necessarily recognize. But it's also this idea that members of a nation state need to work collectively to dismantle systems of oppression. So basically, if we want to get rid of inequality, we need to work together to eliminate inequality. And this idea that oppression against any group in a nation state is a threat to freedom for everyone. And it's what's called a we-centered approach to social justice. So it's basically encouraging people to look at themselves as members of a larger group rather than just specifically an individual. And so I'll use kind of structural racism as an example of what I mean by that. So there can be something that's called like kind of a dependent or a you-centered approach, which means that government just needs to end racial discrimination, right? And there's really kind of no recognition of what the citizen might need to do in order to see that happen. There's independent, which is an I-centered view of structural racism, so that like racism is just an individual action, so it's just individuals who are racist or not racist, and there's no kind of recognition of the state. And then there's that interdependent, we-centered form, and that's really that it's the responsibility of all of us to dismantle racism, and it's cut off there, I apologize for that, dismantle racism in all its forms. So it's the responsibility of the state, of the government, it's the responsibility of people of color, but it's also the responsibility of white people to be allies in this. It's the responsibility of everyone. And you can apply this to anything, whether it's structural racism or heteropatriarchy, so the ways in which women and LGBTQ people are systematically oppressed in U.S. society, right? That it's the responsibility of the state and it's the responsibility of straight people to work to dismantle that oppression in all its forms, right? So it's the responsibility of everyone, and we all need to work together to envision what a truly equitable world might look like and what we need to do to accomplish that. And so that's really the end of social justice and what that means. So please let me know if you have any questions about this content. Thank you.